Ladies and gentlemen, in just a moment, Inspiring Honesty with Greg Brahe and co-host Bob Greaves will be on the air. Listen to this music written by Bob Greaves himself.
Hi, and welcome back to Inspiring Honesty. I'm your host, Greg Brahe, and I'm an atheist. And today, I will be joined again by my wonderful co-host, Bob Greaves, and we are going to try to continue last week's conversation about it's related, I guess, to theist, but what religion is and what faith is in operational definitions of the terms, how we can come up with a way that we can with a great deal of clarity, use those terms so that other people can understand what we as individuals mean by, if we can agree on operational definitions, or at least expose our own in that respect so that misunderstandings can be more easily remedied before conflict that is unnecessary comes about. So, welcome to the show, Bob. Glad to have you.
Thank you. Yeah, good to
As
be
you
here
can see,
again.
I'm broadcasting from the library up in Eagle River again, so enjoying it. It's a beautiful day out, and
Awesome.
looking very forward to a lot of intellectual scrutiny now. So
I know others can see you, but I can't see you. So are you inside or outside?
I am outside, but the sun angle keeps changing. I was sitting in the shade, but now I'm getting very, very warm.
Yikes. Yikes.
It'll only last a little bit longer, I'm sure, and then it'll get behind another part of this building. So, anyway, last week we talked at length about the definition of religion, and that sort of moved into faith. And I think where we left off was pretty well associated with why these things are good things to even spend time on and to come across. And we were discussing the point behind coming up with an operational definition, as in, is it a way to manipulate the conversation, a la what do you mean by no? That when we ask, is it possible you could be wrong about everything that you know, versus a way to add clarity to a conversation to avoid confusion. And I think that we began settling upon at least the latter for the terms of our discussion. Would you agree on that?
Well, I think that it is possible to use operational definitions for either purpose. It really depends on the integrity and honesty of the person using the operational definition. Furthermore, in some ways, I think that operational definitions are good for a particular operation. But they're not necessarily good for all uses. When an anthropologist is talking about religion, they have no need to define it the exact same way, or to even pretend to be defined. They may have a very specific concept in mind that they use anthropologically, but that isn't necessarily the way the word has to always be used whenever you're going to use it around them. And so I think it can be a useful tool in clarifying, that way we can eliminate bringing in unnecessarily other possible meanings that allow a misunderstanding of something that was stated.
I agree, and I think that's why I decided to delve into this topic, was because I've had plenty of people get offended or confused when I make statements about faith, for one, and other people who will tell me things like atheism is just another religion. And I think that, I find that accusation to be ironic because it seems to be discounting religions in the same way that I do, and therefore is. I don't think that it's an argument that theists should use without.
Well, depending on how they operationally define religion, for example, I think we even discussed the potential of Buddhism. That Buddhism is not there's no divine sense of the Buddha. The Buddha is not considered a divine being, at least not entirely throughout Buddhism. Just it's more the way of the Buddha. Being a way that stands before all people, that leads to an appropriately detached sense of peace with the world without fighting with it, and it's really in some sense a spiritual sense of mind, and but people are devoted to it and its principles based upon an experiential subjective assessment of what they believe to be the meaning behind the metaphysical structure of such a way, and so there's a sense in which I think we can call that a religion, even though it's really a kind of a mystical form of atheism.
Well, and I think that you're right, even wording it in that way demonstrated that religion in its most common usage generally would not apply to, and that's sort of the operational definition that I'm looking at.
Correct.
You said in a sense
Correct.
we might be able to consider it a religion if we take on a less common usage of the term, but the
Right.
usage that I'm shooting for is the in operational definition of the most common usage, something that I believe I have when I use the term religion, and then it gets sort of flipped on its head sometimes when I'm trying to discuss religion, and that's what I'm seeking to avoid by making this
a belief
sort of
in a deity, wherein the principles of interacting with that deity can be known with certainty and prescribed through some form of dogma. Would that work for you as a operational definition of religion?
You sort of blanked out a little bit in the middle, but it sounded like it might be a little bit too restrictive in the fact that it said a deity and not a deity or deities. And I believe you said certain in there. I don't know if you said degree of certainty, but
it would where one can prescribe the principles of interacting with that deity with certainty dogmatically. Because if we're going to consider that an operational definition of religion, then I would personally be a very irreligious theist.
Right, and that's why I think it's too narrow of a description of religion. It's too focused on dogmatism and fundamentalism. I'd see it in more of the anthropological sense of the term when I talk about it. And I pulled up a couple of the anthropologists' definitions here. Let me see if I can.
They probably prefer to use the word cult, but that's also a word that's greatly misunderstood by the general public in terms of the way the anthropologist uses it. But in an anthropological dictionary, a cult is merely a kind of a sub culture within a culture that identifies itself through some commonly held beliefs that are that have some other world or non-material purpose behind them or foundation to them. And there's a sense, I think, in which the anthropologists would consider Buddhism a cult in that sense. But when they use the word cult, they're not talking about somebody controlling and manipulating and trying to get all your property donated and stuff like that.
Well, I think I'm looking at a handful of them here. Durkheim said a unified set of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, that is to say, things set apart and forbidden, beliefs and practices which unite into one single moral community, all those who adhere to them.
Right.
There's also, Geertz went a system of symbols which acts to establish powerful, pervasive, and long-lasting moods and motivations in men, formulating concepts or conceptions of general order of existence, and clothing these conceptions with such an aura of factuality that the moods and motivations seem uniquely realistic. That, I think, is a very postmodern way of wording that.
Very behavioralistic too. Yeah. Strange. I don't. Yeah. So you'll find that even among people who are seeking to professionally, and so therefore, I think when you're reading those people's works, it's helpful.
I should say that those were 70 years
they,
apart. The latter being the more recent.
Yeah. Yeah. When you're reading these people's works, it's good to know what their definition of these terms are, because that's what they mean by it more often than not. By the way, Eric Hovind and Cy Ten weren't the only people. We all tend to run astray of what we think our operational definitions are without realizing it, because words just kind of have a life of their own, and we tend to use them in that way, and they do get away from us.
Oh, certainly. I want to say, though, this is the definition that I thought was better. It's still not perfect, but it says, a set of beliefs and or actions to regulate and approach reality expressed in A, doctrine, B, philosophy, C, myth, D, symbol, E, ethic, ritual, matter, experience, and social organization in some way related to spiritual qualities, phenomena, or entities. I think that's
good.
The first part is sort of a category of the things that it might be related to, and it says but I'd say that even if it excludes one or two of those things, a religion is sort of an encompassing worldview that would relate to these things. That includes the spiritual qualities, and in my usage, some sort of super or supranatural aspect, something that is outside of the natural realm interacting with it. That is what sets apart a religion and a philosophy.
Copy and paste that if you can. I think it would be good to return to that one from time to time. It was a good one. That is an operational definition I think we could talk from, because I think it is both sufficiently specific as well as sufficiently broad to particularly if we even change some of those ands to an or. Sometimes, like when you read in if you read it, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Disorders, sometimes it'll say, at least 3 of 7 of the following, and it could be any
right. And I
3
think
of those
that's
7.
probably the best way to consider it, is to look at it in sort of a diagnostic sense. I often the last show I did with Joey was about mono and polyamory and gammy. And that one, I kept arguing with him that he was using a descriptive sense instead of a proscriptive, and that's what I was trying to argue for, is that those words need to be used in a normative sense, whereas I think religion, on the other hand, is best understood in the opposite direction, in a descriptive sense. You can look at what something is and then say, is that a religion or not, and say then, and that's what the operational definition is really useful for.
Right, yeah, because any proscribing is going to be done only within that community.
Right, and I certainly also think that there is a value of recognizing it may not fit every piece of the puzzle in every circumstance, but when it fits the mold closely enough, we can call it a religion. I would generally agree. But the one
I can agree
absolute
with that.
I would
if it's 85% of this, close enough. Yeah.
Right. But again, the caveat that I will make on that is, for me, for it to be considered a religion in a common usage form, I mean, again, we can nuance and come up with other usages, but in a common usage form, it needs to involve the supernatural. That's the hitching point for me on what makes something.
Okay, let's come up with the definition then of supernatural, because, personally, I don't believe in supernatural. To me, it is a meaningless term. I realize that there are people who use it.
Natural. That is generally understood as that which is outside of the scope that we currently understand as natural.
Okay.
Better.
There's plenty of things that are scientific that are outside of the domain of what we understand as natural. But even when we discover such things, we're not anticipating that we're going to discover that they somehow are an exception to the laws of physics or something.
Well, that's what I mean, though, is when we find something that we say it's outside of a supra or supernatural, would be something
Yeah.
that would not conform to the laws of physics as we know them, and that would be a paradigm shifting discovery if we were to
But
confirm it
could
as something.
could we say the laws of physics as they are known or may be not yet known? Because I don't think that I wouldn't
I'd
want
say
to
as they are
presume
known.
that we actually understand the laws of physics. And for example, if Jesus actually healed anybody, um, I, I would be more inclined to think that he knows something about this that we don't. You know, he's more familiar with where the buttons are or something. I don't know, but
Well, and that might
uh,
be one very naturalistic way to understand
yeah,
the miracle aspect, but I think that that's not the common way, once again. The common
right.
way is
It
to
is
understand these things as magic. So, yeah, I mean,
right.
the soup, something beyond the level, and that's, to me, what define. And you might be right that you are irreligious in that respect, since you do have a very naturalistic understanding. But for me, it is it's basically an appeal to the super or supranatural that makes
Right.
something
Yeah.
religious.
And
The belief in.
I find that a cop out personally, which is the reason to me, that which is done is on a continuum of understandable to non-understandable. But at no time do we leave the realm of reality, in that which is done, so as a result, I even look at I can concede, for example, that the biblical use of the word miracle involved the experience of events that these people had no clue how to explain. But I don't think that just because they had no clue how to explain them, that they lacked explanation or that they somehow violate the laws of nature. Just because, I mean, there's a lot of things we do today that if people from the years in which Jesus walked the earth were to come into this day and see us do, they would be like, you know, to them it
Well,
would be
Bob,
like
you're talking
magic.
like an
And
atheist here, and I can appreciate
yeah,
that, but I have to say that we need to sort of make a distinction here to even say um, that I mean I otherwise we're sort of defining supernatural out of existence, and I don't think that
yeah,
that's the case for how people understand. People understand the
right.
supernatural
So
to be something that does exist. Plenty of people do. You and I may not, and
I don't. Yeah,
I actually agree with that. But
yeah,
there are plenty of people that do, and that's I think
right.
what defines something as a religion to me is in the belief that something it falls outside of the laws of physics as we currently understand them, something that is able to defy these laws of physics.
Basically, they believe God cheats.
Right.
We're
The,
subject to
the
these
sort of the
rules, and
omnipotence.
he can break all. That's God cheats. What a
And it doesn't
dishonest.
necessarily have to be God. I mean, we could appeal to
Right.
some sort of a
Right.
pagan
That's witchcraft.
mysticism that, right, witchcraft is not necessarily God related, but it's magic. And
Hmm.
magical thinking is sort of the operative um, terminology for that turns
Yeah.
something into a religion for me.
Yeah,
If
and
that makes sense.
Merlin was a great story, I tell you, but I don't believe it. Uh, you know,
So, I think that we've actually stumbled upon a pretty clear understanding of
what
what
we
we can
might be
use for
meaning when we
religion.
use the word religion. I would want to say, though, that I don't think that we have the right to prescribe that others ought to use it only in that way. I think that it's helpful for us to define it perhaps in that way and say that's what we mean by it when we're talking about it.
And we can even go so far as to say that's generally what we mean by it. But
Right.
if what I think that the other value of a operational definition is that it is an opportunity for us to recognize if we are deviating from that and to denote such in conversation. And I think that
Right.
as long
Yeah.
as you and I can agree
Yes.
on that as our general one, if we
Mhm.
intend to use it in a differing way and we recognize so, then we
It brings
can
clarity.
state that to bring clarity. Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's, I think, very helpful in that respect. So, to move on from there, we also talked about faith.
Hmm.
And faith, I think, is related in my
Faith.
mind, at least, or when I talk about religious faith. Once again,
Oh,
I sort of
okay. Religious faith. I would consider religious faith merely faith that is applied in that direction. I do not see the difference of any kind of faith in terms of cognitively how it operates. But I would define faith this way: it is belief in something as certainty, even though I really don't understand it or know why it is that way, but I believe it is that way. I mean, for example, an example of this might be, I don't believe that we actually possess psychological, biological, or genetic proof that pedophiles cannot be changed. But there are a lot of people who believe they can't be. Uh, I don't believe necessarily that that's true, although I do think that if they can be changed, we have not yet discovered how that happens.
Well, anybody who's seen or
And
read A Clockwork Orange may have a couple of ideas.
a tremendous movie, horrible movie.
Really is.
That was something else. Did you ever have you ever seen that?
Oh, I've seen the movie and I've read the book.
Yeah.
But I think, once again, it's a very Skinnerian approach. There's a great book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity, written by B.F. Skinner himself, that really goes at length into how we can change people's behavior, even if we can't change their thoughts. And that might be, well, it might even be applicable to the cognitive aspect of it. But we have not really verified that quite yet.
I think that changed behavior automatically forces thoughts to, at least in some way, comply in some way. But yeah, but it in some ways, that technique, depending on what it is, can actually be a form of abuse.
I'm not saying they can be ethically done. I'm just saying it can be done.
Mm-hmm.
That's certainly a conversation for another day. But
well, I think an ethical way of doing it is if you're dealing with people who have what you call borderline personality disorder. These are people who fail to empathize with the impact they're having on people in their inequitable demands. And one of the things that you need to do with a person who's borderline personality, if they become hypercritical, is the moment they become hypercritical, you end the conversation and leave the room. You refuse to have any interaction with them. And it frustrates them. It angers them. They think that you're being disrespectful. They'll have all sorts of things. But after a while, when they start becoming what you perceive as disrespectful and hypercritical, and you're not going to be a part of that conversation, they learn after a while that form of behavior, for reasons they don't understand, is simply not going to work. They eventually begin to develop other strategies, not because they have empathy, but because they're still trying to be effective. And so you basically choke off their lack of empathy in their behavior. And it's a form of behavior modification in a sense, you know?
Sure, I do that with my toddler. We give him timeouts when he's behaving in a way and that basically just means shunning him for a short period of time. We tell
until
him
he
to
figures
sit
out,
somewhere.
I got to do this differently, don't I? Yeah.
Right, exactly. And it's a negative reinforcement in that respect. We do something that he finds unpleasant until he starts conforming to what we want him to do, in which case he can resume his pleasant activities. It certainly works. Once again, the operant conditioning of Skinner is a powerful, powerful thing.
It is an axis upon which human beings do interact. Yes.
But I think we've strayed a bit. I wanted to talk about why I think religious faith is a different thing. And when I do use the terminology, it I think is a significant one, a significant enough difference to warrant its own definition. Because I see religious faith.
I can accept that we could have a definition for religious faith, but I think that even though there'd be a lot of religious faith that I would consider bad and harmful, I don't think that you and I would necessarily agree on what makes it bad.
Well, and this is what gets me
Yeah.
going on this one is I'm going to define, I believe, religious faith in such a way that I always find it to be bad or harmful, or always
Okay.
at least potentially bad or harmful. And that I think is the key hitching point is that I don't think that religious faith necessarily, again, I'm playing with usages here a little bit, is necessarily related to religion as we defined it. It is a necessary case or necessary precondition for religion, but it actually applies well outside of religion. I see religious faith as a
Okay. Well, so then we're not going to use our operational definition.
well, not a. I see. I'm saying I want to talk about faith and I want to talk about religion. But when we talk about faith,
Right.
there's so many usages. I'm going to say religious faith, but that's using religious just as a
An adjective.
right. Exactly.
Okay.
So
Religion,
it's
religious. Okay. All right. Well,
right.
give me
Religious.
what you think is a useful definition, operational definition of religious faith.
Religious faith to me is a way of reasoning, first of all, and that I think is a key point that differs quite a bit. Is it's actually a method similar to scientific reasoning, which is I guess a contrasting way of reasoning. But religious faith is a way of reasoning that relies upon trust in that which is hoped for or expected due to an authoritative. That's where I struggle, and that's where I'm looking, I guess, to be challenged a bit on this, so I can refine it a bit more, or for your help.
I think you're headed down personally. I think you're headed down an unworkable road by thinking of it as a form of reasoning. Rather, when you and I try to reason, we attempt to reason based on the established agreeable facts. And then, based upon the established agreeable facts, we try to say things that are coherently applicable, that would therefore perhaps be corollaries to the facts in terms of application. But when it comes to some religious faith, I think that they're using reason, and they're using reason correctly. However, they're basing it upon things that they are failing to realize. That's not a fact.
And that's actually
And
what
so,
I'm getting at. That's why I said it's a
right,
way of reasoning.
right.
I'm saying it basically. It is a fallacious manner of reasoning from the outset.
So
It is
okay, yeah.
reliant
So in a
upon
sense, what you're saying is that it is unaware of its failure to rely on fact for its reasoning, and
right
instead
or its
allows
presupposition of fact.
the axioms of faith. Axiom may be even too good a word for it, but allows their well, what do I want to find here? Their points of faith, their principles of belief, to be treated as if identical to, and in many cases, I would say that the religious use it as something which trumps fact. That to me is extremely dishonest. When a person has a faith in something that they think trumps fact, if you know what I'm saying.
Well, or in spite of fact. That's why it has to be more
Yeah.
nuanced than that. I can't go, or I'm sorry, not in spite of, or for lack of would be the better term. I think religious faith can certainly trump fact in many ways, but there's another alternate way in which it is done, where it simply is used as a way of creating fact, or the illusion of fact where none is there, based on hope,
All
or
right.
based on some other non-factual method. For example, there are plenty
It's lazy
of rather
thinking.
liberal Christians who will say they believe in heaven. And this one, I'm going to say, even you, to an extent, you say you believe in God,
Yes.
and you do so and you find it to be compelling to you, but not compelling to anybody else. You don't feel that you have any other way to
I have no
demonstrate
leverage with
this.
it.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly, and that is still falling within the category of faith to me. That when I
Sure.
see that without any sort of outside, without any independent way of verifying it, it is
That's what faith is.
a
Faith
belief
is
from
faith
trust.
is settling into a conclusion that is unfortunately outside the realm of validation. And there are plenty of things that are, I mean, I think science itself proves, every time it proves something that was never proven before, here again is yet something that has always been true, but up until now, we did not know it for certain. And I don't think we can fault people who, as even good, intelligent people, put their faith in a great number of things that at least operationally seem to work and function in a way where that belief serves them well and works, and may yet one day prove to be useful or not, and might prove to be, well, they have to go to something else, whatever. But so, I mean, that's what faith is. And
I would agree. However, I think that faith, as far as once again, religious faith, to make a distinction from faith in axioms or other necessary parts of the worldview, is the portion of it that is drawing a conclusion, where a conclusion cannot justifiably be drawn from the evidence that's available.
why? Why? The mind, just as nature reports a vacuum, so does the mind. Um, and the truth is, everything has an explanation, even if I don't know what it is. And there will be plenty of things for which I may discover the explanation for later, and for which, if I'm going to somehow interact with it, I have to come up with at least a working explanation now. Now, I tend to be
I
a
would
rather
disagree, though. I'd say that that's where something becomes a religious faith versus I think that a justified faith is a faith that is a necessary faith. A religious faith is an unnecessary faith, something that can be that we can go about without having that faith in any sort of structural sense. For example, as an atheist, I don't have a faith in any sort of supernatural or God that any creator or anything of this nature, any afterlife or soul independent of the body. And I still can function. I think I'm proof positive that is not a necessary condition for life. Whereas faith...
Oh, no, it's not. Not at all.
And that's where I'm saying that it's an
I would even go so far as to say it's not even a necessary condition for having a soul that can exist independent of the body, which I may have just offended you terribly. I know I'm in timeout, but you don't need to have even belief in that which is real in order for that which is real to be present, and to even deal with it to the degree that you think of it as real. Those, to me, as I understand, they're two completely different things, and it's not required in order to function. That plenty of people function and get a lot of things done operating on absolutely false presumptions of what they think is established fact. And they do fine. A lot of people who do business based upon concepts they think are going to make them money, and it may be true that they're even very successful, but not for the reasons they think they are. So, it's to me, the fact that you function well without a belief in that is wonderful, and also, in my opinion, unremarkable. I don't see how it relates to the reality of those things. Anyway.
Well, and I think you helped me elucidate this a little bit with that, when in saying that plenty of people do just fine with these assumptions or the way that they see things, and business owners act upon things that they may even be successful with, and that's all true of religious faith, and I'd actually say that qualifies religious faith. I think that the best way for me to describe religious faith then, in sort of an operational definition, would be a deviation from the default null hypothesis, a sort of a default positive hypothesis on something would be the definition without a unjustified positive hypothesis. Again, if it's justified in necessity or utility, then it certainly could be made
Now,
an argument that it's not religious.
let me ask you this. In the field of psychology, when we're dealing with people who are struggling and suffering, we have various different schools of thought. And within those schools of thought, we have various different therapists who might work with and deal with various clients. And we will find within those schools of thought people who possess different, what I call different degrees of actual belief in the particular theories that they feel explain the problem. To the point that they would be very hesitant to abandon a particular strategy based on that. And I think that it would be impossible for each of these different schools of thought to actually do therapy without them possessing some level of belief in the credibility of this theory. So I would see that belief there, unjustified, is absolutely essential to their doing their job.
But I'd say that you simply made a case for it being justified in its utility and in its necessity. In that
so you don't think that religion can have any utility?
I'm not saying that it cannot have utility. Basically the argument that I'm making is that a religious faith, as defined, is a faith that is not justified in its utility in that respect. I don't know. See, it's tough. It's tough to come up with an operational definition because
Can I make a suggestion? Is it possible? Is it possible that the reason why this is tough is because you want to have an operational definition that you can then impose on someone else? Now, I really think that if none of this makes sense to you, that's wonderful for you. You can do that, and you shouldn't move from that until you have really good reason to do so. But at the same time, I don't know that that's necessarily the kind of thing you could prescribe to others. However, if others begin violating you without regard to why they're violating you or what they justify their violating, if they're violating you, plain and simple, they're violating you, and you don't need to actually even understand why or how. You can just draw the line. So I wonder if you're trying to bite off more than you can really chew. I would wonder because, I can meet you the halfway where I can recognize how atheism makes complete, coherent sense, and that it's possible for a person to be an atheist and that this is not a symptom of anything inappropriate or wrong going on inside of them or their thinking. But at the same time, I couldn't think that, therefore, this is the only coherent way that people put stuff together because, not to sound like Satan, we don't know everything, and we don't know the various experiences of others that cause certain things to, just for them, be far more compelling than what to you seems sufficient, and to them feels extremely blank and absent and devoid of that which explains what they are experiencing. So I wonder if you're trying to bite off more than you can chew, and it's good enough that as an atheist you've made a good argument for your own position. What? Go ahead. You were breaking up. I couldn't hear you.
I might be trying to bite off more than I can chew with this one, but the reason that I'm doing so is because of the role that I take. I am, at least sort of thrusting myself into the role of an advocate for atheism in a way, or against religious faith. Therefore, it is necessary for me to be able to define something that I do have a certain concept of within myself. I'm just having a difficult time articulating that concept. Mm-hmm. And I do spend a great deal of time criticizing it because I believe religious faith, as I understand it, although I'm having a difficult time articulating exactly what I mean by that, is a dangerous and harmful thing to the world. And
I think there are many good cases of demonstrating how that has been so. But I think it comes far more from a disrespect of a proper set of priorities than it comes from. And by the way, religious people who use religious belief as a way of trumping fact are going to be the most violating people. And so see here the problem is not religion as I would see it, even religions that I don't agree with, but rather a failure to appreciate the how to organize this in terms of dealing successfully with reality. The moment we take any religious belief and allow it to trump reality, we have already violated everybody and anyone who relies on that reality for their boundaries automatically.
I think
And
actually I'm going back a bit in my mind here to draw upon the definition I sort of came up with it being a deviation from the default null hypothesis. I think actually is probably a better definition of that than I understood, or than I did in the first place. Because you then brought up psychologists and therapists using something, but I don't think that is a deviation from the default null hypothesis for them at all. It may be in their mind, or it may actually objectively come out to be an incorrect understanding of evidence that they've seen. But I think that generally there's been evidence that has supported this. Now,
sure,
homeopathy and
supporting evidence is not proof. However, it is. I think that, for example, therefore, we're onto something here. Perhaps that when somebody believes something for which there's not proof, as long as there is corroborating evidence that sustains some level of coherence, that it's not therefore entirely unreasonable for them to say, "I think this goes farther than I can take it," but
you see, I think we're getting a little closer to it now, because there is I'm looking at some of the viewer comments here. We have a prefabricated construct on how to deal with objective reality is another one that somebody had granted us. But I really think that just the deviation from the burden of proof, maybe that might be a better way of saying it.
Right.
Or
now the deviation for the burden of proof is for assertions that one wants to compel upon another. Now, one thing here I think we want to avoid is humanistic arrogance. There is no way that we as human beings can possibly know that we even possess the sensory perception to know all that's out there in reality. We have eyes to see light. We have skin that can feel and touch textures and pressures. We have a nose that can smell odors and a tongue that can taste. We have ears that can hear variations of atmosphere.
You're making a very clear point that humans are limited in our capacity to understand the universe, but that doesn't mean that we can therefore...
aspects of energy going on in this universe that are operating on an axis that our senses are so unaware of that we haven't even thought to build detectors for them.
Well, and I think that's the thing, though, Bob, is there might be, and there's no way for us to say necessarily that there's not, but that doesn't mean that we can reasonably or justifiably conclude that there are. Once again, the deviation from the default...
We can't do it dogmatically. I would
even
say
non-dogmatically, even come up with it in a hypothetical sense without other or external justification for it, and independent of our own subjective...
well, how about this? Dogs can hear certain frequencies human beings can't. We also know something about some subsonic frequencies. 17 hertz, for example, can cause a person to feel the presence of someone around them. There's something about that vibration that has also been determined to be the disturbance of the atmosphere when you're in close proximity to another living body. So that when that frequency is produced, it creates the sensation. These are things that people who don't understand these things might not know how to explain some of these things. But at the same time, we do know of beings who we've been able to test and determine hear frequencies outside of the human range. So we do know that there are actual living examples of beings that live on planet Earth that can sense things we cannot. And
you're right. But again, you're making an appeal to the fact that we are limited. But I think that is a reasonable justification or a reasonably justified conclusion to say that there are things that exist outside of our ability to perceive them or measure them or test them. But to draw any conclusions about what those things are is what's the unjustifiable portion of it.
Perhaps, yeah. Particularly depending on how you want to apply it.
And that's what I view religious faith
I'd want there to
be.
be some
That's
reason
sort of
why why that belief was functionally useful, which brings us back to utility.
Right, and certainly there is some utility behind religious faith that can apply. As I've mentioned before, it can certainly be comforting in times. I mean, a faith in an afterlife would certainly be a comforting thing in the time of death, and it, in that respect, can have a massive amount of utility. The reason, however, that I think that such a way of reasoning, and I'm again going to jump outside of the realm of only religion, and say that this actually applies to things like politics or conspiracy theories or medicine, or to say, I mean, astrology, to say, well, we know that the gravity from the moon affects the tides. Look at how powerful that is. And we know that there's things that we don't understand, and we know that there's things that we've arbitrarily deemed to be constellations in the sky. So therefore, these things are all related and affect your entire life and based on the day you were born. I mean, it's silly in a respect to.
I wouldn't be surprised.
I
wouldn't be surprised if we could find out someday that the pull of the moon is something that we can actually feel in our body that might affect mood. I don't know. I could see how that's possible, but how we could ever know exactly how that knowledge applies would strike me as being huge guesses.
Well, yeah, I mean, it might even be reasonable to say that the tide being out would obviously be an effect of the pull of the moon's gravity on the opposite side of the world, pulling the water towards that side. And that would therefore theoretically make you feel a little heavier, pulling your own water supply down. I don't know. I mean, in some tiny, tiny way, it might be for affecting us.
And who knows how it can affect us. I mean, we've recently even discovered how not the ear, but the pinea, the way it distorts the sound based on the direction it's coming toward the ear, alters things in frequencies that are so high that we don't experience them as sound. But we nonetheless, we can prove that the human being is capable of directionally locating the source of a sound without the ability to do the math to indicate how two ears can do that. If someone is behind you and high or behind you and low, how would you know that from just 2 points of hearing?
I don't know, but it would be very unusual to draw the conclusion that it happens because of magic or some sort of sixth sense or an ability that is unrelated to our hearing. For us to say, well, since we can't understand exactly how it comes from hearing, it must be because we can sense the electromagnetic field emitted by that person with some detector that we've yet to discover. That's what I mean, is by appealing to things outside of the naturalistic sense or things that are unrelated or unsupported by where we're at.
Which is why I don't prefer any form of personal faith, although I have no apology for having faith. My faith never seeks to explain what God may or may not do in terms of anything that violates that nature.
And that's where I think that when I talk to you about faith, it's a difficult conversation because the way that you use faith is not the way that most believers would use faith. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I can't even relate to how they do it.
And that's, I think, when I use faith, when I say faith, I'm trying to appeal to the usage that they use. Do you feel that the definition that I've come up with now is closer to the definition, the ones that most?
Perhaps I would say that that for many of them, they find faith to be a shortcut to fact. That it allows them to possess that which they think of as identical to fact, without having to go through the hard work of demonstrating that it is indeed fact. And so then they treat it as fact, and then many of them will then not only treat it as fact, but treat it as something that even possesses some superiority to fact, to trump it, And that, in my opinion, makes them just radically unreasonable.
Well, I think that you're absolutely right, but I still think that you're getting a little too detailed in that one and a little too restrictive, because we're going to have to come back to this because we are out of time for this week. But a friend of mine once said that faith is an expectation, a very religious friend, an expectation of that which is hoped for. And I think that that actually applies to even more religious people, that even if they don't necessarily consider it to be an absolute fact, they have a trust that it is the case, because the alternative, the fear of the alternative, is too terrifying to them to face. So therefore, they take this as the
hope
default.
in what it brings is wonderful enough that the alternative doesn't really require they think about it.
Right. If the utility that is justifying your faith is coming from the comfort that it gives you, and not in any other necessary fashion, that's a key indicator that it is a religious faith to me. So we may have to come back to this next week. Or
would you like it if I tell you this one last thing? I know we're a little over time. Let me tell you, would it make you feel better if I were to tell you this? What if it turns out that you're right, and when I die, there's just absolutely nothing, and I'm just gone? I'm okay with that. I don't feel like I need to be around. If it turns out you're right, wonderful. I don't care. I really don't care.
And the same is true if it turns out that you're right, and when I die, I don't really know what happens, but there's maybe something, and that there's could be a maybe, I don't know, then that's okay too.
Yeah. I need to live my life good enough for what I do know is here right now.
Exactly. And I think that on that we've been able to settle upon something that is useful, at least to us, is that faith, when it draws us away from that, it can be a very dangerous and harmful thing.
I think so. Abusive. Yeah.
Right. Well, this has been Inspiring Honesty. Stick around for the Unconventional Pastor coming up next, and then for the place where I don't remember all the guests that are going to be a part of it, to be honest, but we are going to have a few guests with Dr. Jones today. One of them being Christopher Mowdy, who joined us for a hangout the other day. And I'm looking forward to hearing about that and then watching it down the road. I, unfortunately, am about to lose my battery power once again. So you have a great remainder of your weekend, a great show coming up next, Bob, and join us again next week for Inspiring Honesty.